Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about Quebec's amendments to their French language law, which were in a bill called Bill 96. That bill amends the province's Charter of the French Language, famously known as Bill 101, but it also makes changes to the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, the Civil Code of Quebec, and perhaps most controversially, the Canadian Constitution. The bill was adopted by Quebec's National Assembly in May of 2022, but certain parts only just came into force in June of this year. These newly enforced provisions include restrictions on communication with the provincial government in languages other than French, French language requirements for certain contracts, and the requirement that small businesses tell the government how many of their employees don't speak French. The law was designed to protect the use of French in Quebec, but has prompted protests, court challenges, and concern from English speakers, as well as other minority language speakers, as well as legal experts. Here today to talk about what Bill 96 means, including the newly enforced provision, are two experts, lawyers Julius Grey and Alexandre Fallon. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Let's start with what this law does very broadly. Julius, we'll start with you. What is the purpose of this law, and how has it played out so far?
Well, the official purpose of this law is to protect the French language and to prevent it from disappearing. The real purpose is something very different because there is no danger to the French language. The danger is invented. There used to be a danger before Bill 101, when there was freedom of choice in education. And then you can imagine that all the immigrants might have gone to English school and basically anglicized Quebec. But there is no danger right now. And the purpose of the law is to make Quebec completely unilingual. It's an expression of disdain for the minority, really, or for the tradition. They say that they want to make Quebec French safe in Quebec. But in fact, they're not preserving French. What they're doing is they're rolling back English. They're trying to prevent any other language from being used. So it's a false pretext. It's a false assumption that French is in danger. And it's basically a restrictive law which reduces rights of all people, Francophones, as well as Anglophones and immigrants.
Alexandre, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. What's your perspective on the purpose of the law and anything you want to respond to in what Julius has said there?
Well, I think the purpose of the law is to reinforce the protections of the French language that have been enforced since the 70s. From my perspective, I'm not really qualified to say whether it's a good purpose or a bad purpose, so I won't go there. But suffice to say, it's certainly the law certainly does take measures that are quite drastic. I think the biggest element from my perspective as a business lawyer is the fact that the law empowers every single Quebec resident to sue any company that offers products or services in Quebec if they're not satisfied with the degree in which those products or services were offered in French. And so it introduces a huge level of risk for companies, both Quebec companies and international companies that do business in Quebec. And I think that that's probably the biggest risk from where I'm sitting is a reduction in products and services offered to Quebec residents because of these new risks posed by the law.
Now, we've only got about a minute left, but I want to follow up on what you just said there, Alexandre, because I'm thinking of companies like Amazon, for example, or online companies, even small online retailers that you can have an item shipped into Quebec. Would this law apply to those, maybe even mom and pop foreign-based shops that ship things into Quebec? Could they be liable for not offering their services in French, even though they're located in a completely different jurisdiction?
Yeah, there's certainly a risk, and it's certainly the government's position that it certainly does. As soon as you sell something into Quebec, wherever you're situated, that transaction, from the government's perspective, should be governed by Quebec law and these language rights attached to that. And that's really a function of the fact that the Quebec Consumer Protection Act already provides that if you are doing an online transaction, that transaction is deemed to be concluded at the residence of the consumer, which is in Quebec, and therefore Quebec law applies. That's their position.
Yeah, I can certainly see some practical concerns arising out of that. We've got to go to commercial break right now, but I want to get your response to that online vendor issue when we come back, Julius. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Bill 96, which is Quebec's French language law, and in particular, how it applies to Quebec businesses or even international businesses that might be selling in Quebec, including online vendors who might ship goods into Quebec. Now, in the last segment, we were talking about perhaps some of the practical concerns of requiring those businesses in foreign jurisdictions to do business in French if they want to ship into Quebec. Julius, can you expand a little bit on that particular aspect of Bill 96?
Well, I think there, as Alexandre said, there is a risk. We don't know how the courts will react. I think it is arguable that you cannot apply the law and set up barriers, artificial barriers when people are outside Quebec. And I note that there was a case, and having nothing to do with language, but with lenses and optometrists, which said that you can send lenses across the country and even from the United States, and they can't stop it. But it's a risk. And the problem with this law is that you know that the government is gung-ho. The government really wants to apply this law, and it's going to look askance at anybody who challenges it. And many companies are just going to comply out of fear. And that is one of there's a general sense of fear to resist, fear to get in their bad books. That's why they might get away doing things that technically would be illegal. I would think putting up a trade barrier for people who are outside Quebec might be illegal, but I wonder if people will not simply comply.
Now, there's some other provisions of this legislation that are now in effect, including provisions that relate to government services, contracts, and this requirement for small businesses to disclose the number of people who work there who do not speak French. Alexandre, can you elaborate on what those provisions do and how they're going to be impacting business and consumers in Quebec?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact is on the contracting requirements. And so this new requirement is essentially every non-negotiable contract. So if you go and rent a car and you have to enter into terms of service for the rental, that's a non-negotiable contract, or else you won't get the car. They now have to systematically be provided to Quebec consumers and businesses as well in French, even if the business or the consumer has told the merchant, I am an Anglophone, I want to contract with you in English. They still have to go through the motions of providing a French version to that person. And the consequences of not doing so are significant in the sense that someone can ask for the unenforceability or the annulment of that agreement on the sole basis that it wasn't provided to them in French from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, how could you agree to a contract that you can't read?
I think I'd add that I think the problem of services in English with the Quebec government is a serious one too. Those services have always been available. Not everybody has to give them. There may be a unilingual employee in Quebec City who just passes the call to his colleague. But now they're refusing. And for instance, on the front page of the Gazette today, it appears that an elderly woman they hung up on her when she insisted on speaking English about her husband's medications. I think that is a very serious problem. And once again, it shows that this law is not there to conserve the French. It's to roll back things that have been there before. It's extremely frustrating to have a situation where a public servant who knows English is going to be put under pressure, and they are put under pressure. It's not just the civil servants, it's the possibility of discipline, going to be put under pressure not to provide services to an elderly person who needs them. It's absolutely inconsistent with Canada's and Quebec's traditions.
Alexandre, we've got about a minute left. Any commentary on the government services aspect of this law?
Yeah, well, I guess the problem with that is that it really puts the onus on people to prove that they're entitled to English language services, and therefore I think that gives rise to situations like what Julius was referring to, where, it's up to individual civil servants to accept or not accept that the person has made the demonstration that they are entitled to English service. So the letter of the law is there to protect Anglophones, but in practice, I agree with Julius that it puts a lot of discretion in the hands of individual civil servants.
Yeah, that story is certainly very disturbing because healthcare is such an important service. It's not the only one that has really immediate and urgent consequences. I'm thinking of things like 911 calls, other emergency services that could potentially be impacted. Now, there are some exceptions to the law. Some people still have a right to be served in English. When we come back, I want to get to who those exceptions are. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Bill 96, which is Quebec's French language law. Now, Alexandre, some people including these new provisions, still have a right to be served in English. Can you tell me who these people are and why they get these exceptions from the law?
So the charter has always provided for the ability of Canadian citizens, I should say, who have either undergone their primary schooling, the majority of their primary schooling, or were entitled to. That's what we call the notion of ayant droit, so as of right people. And so those are recognized as the traditional Anglophone community of Quebec or the rest of Canada. And those persons are entitled still to services in English from the Quebec government when they are interacting with the government as an individual. As soon as they're interacting in a business capacity, they lose that right. So you're a small business owner and you want to apply for a permit, even if you're recognized as an Anglophone and entitled to individual services, you're not entitled to those services when you're acting through your business. The other exemption is in respect of First Nations and recently landed immigrants. So for the first 6 months after they enter the territory, they're entitled to services in a language other than French. But once the 6 months are up, they lose that entitlement.
So, Julius, what do you want to add to that?
About that, it's a preposterous thing. The so-called historic Anglos, based on the right to educate children in English. For instance, I have that right. I was an immigrant, but I was in English school long enough to retain the right. But what is peculiar is that my wife, who's a French Canadian, has the right because of me. So she could be an old Anglo and make a claim to being served in English, whereas people who have lived here all their life but don't have that right, people from English-speaking areas, the United States, Britain, the islands, they don't have the right. It's absolutely absurd. Now, what is also very disturbing is that right appears to be given very parsimoniously, and people are going to prefer not to use English. There's a general feeling we don't trust them. They won't give us the same service. They might investigate whether we really have the right or not. So people are not, even if they really can't express themselves in situations which are very serious, like being before the courts, being before the tax people, being in the health system, they will not do it for fear of not getting services. And generally, most people simply do not trust that there's going to be fairness.
Now, Julius, I want to ask about this requirement on small businesses to disclose the number of employees that they have that cannot communicate in French. And that disclosure is actually made public. So what exactly is the purpose of that provision? What's the purpose of making it public? And what, especially if these are not customer-facing employees? And additionally to that, there's already a widespread labor shortage across Canada in a lot of especially low-wage jobs. So how can the government be justifying this requirement in the face of that labor shortage?
Officially, they're going to tell you that they're just compiling statistics on the use of French. But in reality, the purpose is to discourage the hiring of Anglophones. People are going to be afraid to have to disclose to the government and to be sued afterwards if somebody is not served, if some person can't answer them in French. And so the purpose really is to make it very difficult for somebody who doesn't speak French well to stay in Quebec. And of course, more and more people who are not in my position of a sort of really bilingual family working in both languages, but many of my Anglophone friends are simply saying, our children are out of here. Nobody's going to stay. Because you can't be certain that there will be a just attitude towards it.
Alexandre, anything on that, on the disclosure purpose and the impact on businesses that need to hire people when there's already a shortage?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I agree with Julius on that. I mean, time will tell. This is new. The stated intention is quite clear: is that the government, with the amendments, have created a new organization called Francisation Quebec, and the purpose of that organization is to offer language training in the workplace. And so the official line is that this is a compilation that allows Francisation Quebec for companies that do not have the obligation to already report this information to the regulator because they have at least 50 employees in Quebec. Mm-hmm. So for those smaller businesses, this is the government's stated intent, a way of measuring which businesses need the services of Francisation Quebec in terms of having a very high proportion of people who in their workforce who don't speak French.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Quebec's Bill 96, which is the French language law. Now, Mr. Grey, Julius, you are involved in a number of challenges to this law, and I think you're involved in 3, but there's many more than that. There's challenges related to the legal profession. There's challenges that are brought by a number of municipalities, including some majority Anglophone municipalities. What can you tell me about these challenges and your role in them?
Well, I'm involved in the general challenge. There are a number of plaintiffs in that. We're all put together by the Chief Justice, but we're challenging the constitutional amendment, the discriminatory parts. I'm particularly concerned about the rights of francophones, bilingual francophones, who are not going to be able to use their English in order to obtain promotion. I'm concerned about the penal parts and the right of the Office de langue française to basically create offenses. I'm also involved in a challenge of the municipalities, which are restricted in even the bilingual municipalities are restricted as to contracts and all sorts of things and cannot operate in English smoothly. And thirdly, I'm involved with some businesses that are contesting the certificat de francisation, where they have to comply with all sorts of requirements from the Office de la langue française, and some of them simply cannot, or it's too expensive, and they will not deal with lawyers or counselors. The person has to go to the Office defenseless, without a lawyer or a specialized counselor, which is again unheard of in our law. So those are the various challenges that I'm involved in. And the legal one, of course, the language of the courts, everybody's challenging that, and I think that will be successful. But the others all have the problem with the notwithstanding clause. So we'll see how that works. But it is a very disturbing situation when people see no way but a challenge in court of really autocratic rules.
Now, Alexandre, I want to ask you about what the public's reaction to the law has been, not just the recent provisions, but the ones that came into force last year. Has the law been popular? Has it been unpopular? I know that there have been some protests. Who's protesting? But my understanding is that there's actually some good, strong public support for the law in Quebec.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think the thing to understand about Quebec is there really are 2 Quebecs, right? There's the Montreal area and there's the rest of Quebec, and they have very different compositions in terms of the population profile. And so I think it's fair to say that this law is very much supported outside of Montreal, and much less so in Montreal. And that is because I think, the reality is there are a lot of people outside of Montreal who don't speak English, and so view this as measures to, protect their rights to be able to interact with businesses in French, and that right has probably not always been up to par. Contrast that with the reaction in Montreal, which is a very bilingual city where people, I think would agree with Julius that, we don't see the problem in Montreal, right? People go to work for global companies in both English and French. And so, I think the view in Montreal is that this is really a law that's looking after a problem that doesn't exist and is not visible in Montreal.
Now, of course, our rights are not guaranteed on the basis of popularity. Julius, any comment on that in about 30 seconds?
Well, I think the law is popular among nationalists. That's the unfortunate thing, and it's totally unpopular among Anglophones. But it's this the proof of popularity of the law is that no political parties, federal or provincial, have been able to come out against it because they're so afraid of losing the 60 seats outside Montreal.
Yeah. That is all the time we have. Julius Grey, Alexandre Fallon, thank you both so much for coming on and sharing your expertise on this really important issue.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We've heard today about new legislation in Quebec that includes changes to workplace laws, municipalities, and that significantly impact minority language rights. How do you think the implementation of this law will play out in the coming years? How well do you think the law will do at preserving and protecting the French language, and at what cost? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Thanks for watching. And remember, a freer Canada starts with you.